I want to tell you about my favorite book from 2020. The book is called Everything Isn't Terrible: Conquer Your Insecurities, Interrupt Your Anxiety, and Finally Calm Down. And it's written by Dr. Kathleen Smith. Now, I think every person on the planet should read this book, from teenagers all the way up to people who are older. Especially if you're in a relationship, you should read this book. I learned so much about myself, and I learned a lot about the negative ways that we deal with anxiety that pops up in our life. And I think one of the biggest breakthroughs that I had for myself was just the realization of how many of my relationship issues in my own marriage and my own life stem from unhealthy ways that I deal with my anxiety. It was a fascinating read. It was a fun read. It was super simple. There's a lot of great humor in it. And today, in today's episode, I got to sit down with the author, Dr. Kathleen Smith, and have an interview with her. And it's jam-packed full of amazing information, and you'll get a great taste of what the book is all about. I hope you enjoy it. Guys, one of my favorite things in the world to do is to meet new relationship nerds, people who are obsessed with relationships like I am, and find out like what their passion is, what their niche is, and then bring them to you. And I feel so lucky. Something that we've been talking a lot about, like on the podcast, and we talk about it a lot in the Epic Wives experiment, is anxiety and overfunctioning and underfunctioning. And a lot of people have written me and expressed desire to learn more about like how to manage their anxiety and how to stop being an overfunctioner or an underfunctioner. And so I went out and I started reading books, and I found my new favorite book. It's called Everything Isn't Terrible. It's by Dr. Kathleen Smith, and she's right here next to me. And
hi, Nate.
We get to talk to you today. I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you for being here.
Well, I'm happy to be talking with you, and this is one of my favorite topics, so I could just riff forever. You'll have to stop me at some point.
Oh, great. I'll pump the brakes if we get going too fast. But can we start at like 101? What is anxiety? Because I think a lot of people have a lot of misperceptions around, like they think it's just a feeling, but what is anxiety, if you could just describe that for us?
Yeah, so the definition I was taught and the one I use is it's your response as a human to a real or a perceived threat. And it's something different than anxiety disorder, right? I think we tend to conflate the two words or terms, but anxiety is just a built-in response every organism has to danger, whether it's real or whether it's not real. And that's really great for surviving and thriving, but it's really bad when you lose that perception of what's real and what's not.
So a lot of the times it sounds like the reason that anxiety does damage to us and to our relationships is because we're detecting a threat when no threat is actually present.
Yeah, or we lose sight of the facts, and we lose sight of our own capability to deal with the reality. And that's when we tend to kind of shift into these automatic responses that work for a little while, but kind of get us into trouble in the long run.
Tell me more about that. How do these automatic responses get us into trouble?
Yeah, the psychotherapy theory I was trained in, which is called Bowen theory, sort of purports that humans aren't very creative. We kind of only have 3 or 4 things that we do when we get anxious, and it's really useful to be able to recognize them. One is to the flight, right? If you're thinking fight or flight, we avoid, we distance. Another is to fight, engage in conflict when we feel threatened. Another is to kind of pull other people in and seek allies to kind of navigate a threat. And then the last thing, which we're going to be talking today, is this kind of seesaw effect where one person becomes over responsible for the other, and then the other one becomes more helpless and less responsible. And that dynamic sort of calms things down in the short term, but it can become locked in, and it can become hard for people to do something different.
Why is that a natural response for us? Like why when somebody feels threatened or if somebody feels anxious, do they have this do we often have this desire to overfunction or to start taking responsibility for things that are not ours, or the opposite, underfunction?
Yeah, well, I think Dr. Bowen would have said that it has a lot to do with our positions in a group or in a family. If you're the oldest sibling, or you, had a mother who was a leader and sort of took over all the time, you might gravitate towards being the one who takes over when things get tense. And somebody else in the family might gravitate towards backing off or shutting down and letting you do that. And that that sort of dynamic stabilizes things. And so people find that it does work. It does calm things down temporarily, but it doesn't help you learn to step back, and it doesn't help the other person learn to become a more capable human. And so I think it has a lot to do with sort of how you grew up and what was your position in your own family, because everybody can over function, but I think those of us who are helpers tend to lean in that direction a little bit more than others, maybe.
Yeah, I think initially when you start over functioning, at least when I start over functioning, it feels good. It feels like I'm being the hero. It feels like I'm being the savior. I'm Mr. Dependable. Everybody can count on me. I can solve all the problems. I'm always reliable. But then it kind of starts to gradually turn into this like unsettling resentment that just permeates all of my interactions with people, and my energy gets sucked dry. And all of a sudden, like, I just feel exhausted and tired, and I'm short-tempered with everybody. And it's doesn't take long for me to like realize that I've been over functioning for a while, because at first it feels great, but not so much down the road.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder why everyone isn't stepping up, and it's because you always do. You know, I have a friend group that I'm in where I used to, well, back in pre-COVID times, you know, I used to be the one who always organized everyone or said, you know, here's where we're going to eat dinner, or I was kind of the person doing that. And I got frustrated. I wondered, why aren't other people willing to do this? And it was because we had shifted into this dynamic. And I was equally responsible, if not more so than everyone else, for ending up, you know, with us functioning that way. But I think it's hard to see sometimes. You just assume people are, you know, they don't want to help, or that they aren't capable, but it has a lot to do with your own behavior.
That's really interesting too, that it kind of, when you slip into this coping mechanism, that you start to see people in the worst light, like you assume the worst of them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's what anxiety has us do. Anxiety asks lots of why questions, lots of cause and effect questions, like, why is this happening? Whose fault is this? And those tend to lead towards blaming a person. And so, you know, when we're caught in that cause and effect thinking, we tend to make the other person the villain, or the person who's slacking or not putting in the effort, which is pretty easy to do.
Okay, so if we identify, so anybody who listening identifies as like an overfunctioner, let's start there. And they're judging their partner, they're feeling burned out, they're becoming resentful. They've got the, if I don't do it, it's nobody will kind of mentality. If I stepped out and stopped doing everything for everybody, their lives would fall apart. You know, this kind of martyr complex. How do you fix that? How do you get out of that? What's a good strategy to start working out of that?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is to not feel like you need to teach other people how to become more responsible. You know, keep the focus on yourself and on what you're doing, and let the other person be responsible for themselves. And the first thing you do is just observe. Can you go throughout your day and notice every little thing that you do for other people that they can completely do for themselves? You know, I hear stories of people, they say, you know, I get to the end of the driveway and I tell my husband to turn right, even though he knows where we're going. Like, why is that an automatic thing, right? Or, you know, I tell someone they need to go to bed at night because it's getting late. Well, that's not your responsibility. You know, you just decide when you need to go to bed. I mean, if it's your kid, it's your responsibility. Right. But if it's like your partner, right, you don't need to do that.
You're going to be tired in the morning if you don't go to bed right now.
And so, you know, there's nothing wrong with helping someone out or supporting them. But, you know, you have to ask yourself, is it really about helping, or is it about just calming me down and helping me manage the stress that I'm feeling that day or in that moment? And I think a lot of the time it's more about the latter than it is about actually pitching in. You know, and so just the simple routines, the simple chores, you know, it can show up in your conversations. You know, I watch my emails. I'll say things like, no worries, or, you know, I'll apologize for things I don't need to apologize for. And that's me being over responsible for people's emotions, right? It's not my responsibility whether somebody worries or not. You know, that's on them. But so it reflects, or it comes out in our language so easily a lot of the time. So I think, you know, the small things you do, how you speak to other people, you know, can you notice when you're being responsible for the thoughts, emotions, behaviors of other people? And those are all opportunities to step back a little bit and see what happens.
So noticing is a first step. So I know that one of the first things that people are going to bump into if they're used to being over functioners is when you have to let somebody else fail, or when you have to let somebody else figure out how to do something their way on their timeline, it can actually cause you more anxiety. And so what do you do in that situation where it's like, this is a way you manage your anxiety, and the way to solve it is to cause yourself more? Like, how do you lean into that and really do it successfully?
Yeah, well, I think you have to lean into the discomfort, which sounds terrible, right? But that's the only way you find a different way to calm yourself down. I think having a plan, saying, okay, this is going to make me feel really distressed to watch this person be less efficient than I can I check out and take some deep breaths, or go take a walk? If you can't be in the room with them, just the simple things and the other ways that we can calm ourselves down. But I think also exercising that muscle of just being in the discomfort increases your tolerance for not over functioning and for letting people kind of flail around a little bit.
Yeah.
I can give an example. I'm an only child, and my mom died when I was in college, and she was very much sort of the leader in our family. And I watched my dad struggle for several years after she died, and I was so over functioning in that relationship. I assumed my dad couldn't do certain things, needed my advice about things. My dad was an adult, right? And over time, thinking about this concept, my dad has surprised me with the capability. People are more capable than we give them credit for. And they actually are much better at navigating their own challenges than we are, because they know more of the reality than we do of their lives. And so it's so freeing over time, even though it might be uncomfortable in the moment, to step back and let people be in charge of their lives. And it makes the relationship so much richer. You enjoy being around people more the less responsible you feel for them. That's why we like our friends so much, because they're not our family. Right? So I think, just to give you one other example, I compare it to, when athletes do high altitude training. I'm going to butcher the science of this, but
No, you won't.
to sort of increase their I guess it's their red blood cell count, and they perform at a higher rate for a couple weeks after they go back to compete in a normal elevation. And so I think of this practice of being uncomfortable, doing something different to manage your anxiety, is kind of that high altitude training, because especially in your family, if you can overfunction less in your family, you can do it anywhere. I think that really is the hardest place to step back from that habit. So that was a very long answer, but hopefully
No, I love your long answers.
Useful.
Give all the long answers that you want.
Yeah.
Why is your family the hardest people to deal with in this regard?
Yeah, because I think the patterns are the most locked in, and we sort of grow up functioning a certain way in our family. We're less likely to treat family members like individuals. We assume we know what they're thinking, what they should do, more so than people we're not related to. We have great ideas about what all our family members should be doing, right? And so it is that much harder to treat them like a self, like an individual, because we just grow up with these patterns. So, like I said, if you can do it there, it's easier to do at work, in a romantic relationship, when you're dating, with friends, just about anywhere. But it's not easy at all.
And I'd like to kind of emphasize that it's not really a destination either. It's like a constant practice that even people like you who are experts on this, like you mentioned earlier, you did this with you noticed you were falling into this role with your friends. And it's like, oh man, like it's a natural tendency to slip into this kind of position for a lot of people. And it's just a constant practice of, where am I doing this and how can I kind of step back away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more you dial up the stress, the more automatic it is. So you might get a handle on it, but then a pandemic happens, or you lose your job, or somebody has an illness, or there's a death in the family, and then you kind of have to do that work again. You kind of regress a little, because it's harder when things are more stressful. We tend to revert to those predictable behaviors.
So I want to go back to your metaphor of high altitude training,
Sure.
because I know that I want to kind of, my job here is to act on behalf of people who are listening who like really want help. And I know that there are people who are hearing this right now and they're going, okay, I get it. Like, I get it. I need to like learn to deal with my anxiety. I need to learn to sit in this a little bit better. I need to like get that red blood cell count higher and increase my capacity to tolerate discomfort. But what happens if I like stop taking responsibility for my partner, for example? Maybe he likes to spend all of his free time just playing video games and neglect all of his responsibilities, or she spends all of her free time scrolling on social media on her phone and playing Candy Crush and just neglects children and responsibilities and whatever else is on her plate or his plate. Doesn't matter either way. What do I do if I start backing off and they just don't show up?
Yeah, so I wrote about this in my newsletter a while ago. It was a case of a woman whose husband wouldn't pick his clothes up off the floor. And she was thinking about her overfunctioning. And, she told me, if I stop doing this, our house is just going to become a disaster zone. He's not going to step up and become more capable. And I told her, I said, I don't know this guy. I have no idea what's going to happen, And I encourage people to think about just the first step. Not to imagine what's going to happen in the future and play it sort of several steps down the road, because your focus is on how do I respond to the reality in the moment? So if I am going to stop picking up the clothes off the floor, that is when I'm going to try and see what happens, And then a week from now, if the floor is covered in clothes, you have to ask yourself, how do I want to respond to the situation? What am I going to put up with or not put up with? And then I come up with the next response, right? And what we tend to do with family members is we're imagining several steps down the road and reacting to that versus what is happening in the moment. And that's how people tend to imagine things being worse than they actually are. And maybe they aren't, but I do, I wouldn't discount the power of treating another person like they can handle it or like it is their problem to solve. That doesn't mean that you might not have to take a position, break up with somebody. I don't know. I wouldn't recommend throwing the clothes out the window, but you'd have to go, what the next step is. But again, it's about the thing about being, more differentiated, more of an individual is you are focusing on your response and not trying to control the other person's response. That's on them to figure out. But this mind reading, this predicting, I don't know how helpful that is, if that makes sense, but if people are able to get clear with themselves about what they want to do when another person behaves a certain way, then they tend to calm down a little bit. They tend to have more productive conversations with their partner, their spouse. The other person is able to hear them a little bit better. But if they're all riled up and frustrated and mad about something that hasn't even happened yet, yeah, the person probably isn't going to change the behavior, So it's about defining how you want to respond, and it's about you calming down a little bit. And I think that does create some space for people to grow up a little bit in the relationship, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. So if you want to be the partner who decides I'm done overfunctioning or underfunctioning, I'm done with this pattern, I want to change my behavior, is it worthwhile to have a conversation with your partner first and tell them like, hey, by the way, I'm going to start changing? Or do you just like stop doing the things that you have been doing to manage this anxiety?
I think it's both. Sometimes it's subtle enough that you can get away with just stepping back and seeing what people do. Other times people are you just want to wait till they notice and then you can say, but I think other times people are able to kind of calmly say, hey, you know what, I've been thinking about this and, I'm just not going to tell you when you should go to sleep at night. That's up to you. You're an adult. I don't feel like that's my responsibility. Maybe that's not the best way to say it, but something akin to that. And, it's all about the sort of the tone and the message too, right? Because if you're coming at someone like, look, you need to be more responsible. I'm tired of doing this, right? That's probably not going to be received well. But if you're able to tell someone, hey, you know what? I've been thinking this doesn't seem to be very effective. you don't go to sleep when I want you to. You end up being annoyed with me for nagging you about it. Like, let's try something different. What if I just let you figure out how to, people are usually more receptive to that, but it is all about sort of how you frame it and how you communicate it.
Maybe even apologizing for ways that you have like tried to manipulate them into doing things that you want to do could be a good place to start.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think whatever you communicate, you have to be willing to follow through with it. So if you haven't really come up with the plan yet, maybe hold back a little bit and then have the conversation later. But you got to do that thinking first about what you're going to do.
Say more about why that's important. About not communicating and like being willing to stick to the plan. Like you can't tell somebody you're going to do something and then not follow through on it.
Yeah, I mean, if you tell your child you're not going to force them to do their homework anymore, you better follow up on that because a kid will test that boundary and push it, right? So you have to be sure that you're ready and you've done enough thinking to know that this is the right course of action, right? And so usually that requires a little bit of observation and a little bit, maybe, talking with a therapist or somebody else who can you can bounce ideas off of, and then you can kind of implement that. But I think if you're just doing it out of frustration in the moment, you're probably going to switch back to that overfunctioning behavior pretty quickly.
Yeah. So we kind of talked about this a minute ago, but it seems like sometimes the answer to less anxiety long-term is more anxiety in the short term. And so what are some things that you would recommend people do to manage or self-regulate that anxiety as it kind of comes up and as you're in this moment of like, oh, I told my kid I wasn't going to help him with his homework anymore, and it's like 10 o'clock and it's bedtime and I know he has a big report. How do I not swoop in and like do it for him or sit down next to him and make them do it?
Yeah. A great question I always have for my therapy clients is, what are the stakes here? And I think that's a great one to ask yourself in the moment. What are the stakes here? Is this, my kid not getting into college they want to get into? Probably not. Right. Maybe the stakes are probably not that high. If it's, clutter or something, is this my house becoming a disaster zone? Like I said, probably not. Right. And so just reminding yourself and asking yourself, what's the reality here? What are the stakes I think is a good question to ask. And that can kind of bring you back to earth when you're spiraling. Right. And then the second thing, I ask people to just kind of check in with their body and say, how is this anxiety kind of manifesting itself in the moment? And are there adjustments I can make, pretty easily I ask people to scale a lot, so if it's 1 to 100, if I'm a 75, to ask yourself, how could I be a 70 in the next 5 minutes? I mean, set the bar really low, not a 0, a 70, right? And so, maybe that just means you relax your shoulders, or you take a few breaths, or you walk outside and just walk around the block. There are so many things that you can do. We forget that we have so much control over our anxiety. Maybe not completely. You can't completely bring yourself down to calmness in a moment like that, but there are little things you can do. And I think having a couple good questions you can ask yourself, like, what is my responsibility in this moment? What are the stakes here? What's the reality? Are great questions because they engage that front part of the brain and not the sort of panicked part that loses touch with reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Tell me a little bit more about this question of what are the stakes? Why does that work so well? And like, what is that supposed to help us think about?
Yeah, I think so I like to compare anxiety, and you probably read this in my book about, I compare anxiety to an alarm or a smoke alarm, right? And so just because my smoke alarm goes off does not mean the house is on fire, right? So if every time I acted like the house was on fire when my smoke alarm went off, it would probably traumatize my kid because she would go, what on earth is happening?
Yeah.
And so when the alarm goes off, when you feel anxious, you have to look around and say, what's going on here? Like,
I'm making bacon again.
Yeah, have I burned some food? Like, do I need to change the batteries? Is there a small fire that can be managed? Or is everything up in flames? And it's usually not the latter, right? And so I think that's, is there a fire is another question I think that's similar to what are the stakes here, that people kind of find useful, because we tend to, anxiety is about sort of worrying about the future, right? So we're like I said, we're 10 steps ahead of ourselves. It's not, is my kid gonna do Tuesday's math homework? Is my kid gonna fulfill their hopes and dreams? Right?
Yeah.
Am I a
Are they
failure
going
as
to
a
make it into
parent?
med school?
Yeah, exactly. And so just, the best gift you can give a kid is to scale it back and to see that disappointment, failure, rejection, these are all very manageable things, right?
Right.
And so that's a better lesson than maybe the math homework getting done.
So when you've got somebody who's stressed out because they've got company coming over and they want to have a clean house and their partner's not helping to clean up, the smoke alarm in their mind, they might be thinking, does my partner even love me? Are my neighbors going to judge me and think I'm a terrible housekeeper, or that I'm a bat? Just, am I going to get all these judgments, and is our marriage going to fall to pieces? When in reality, it's like, man, I really wish the garbage was taken out right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's such a great example of being over responsible for everyone else's thoughts about you, right? I mean, it sounds exhausting, but it's what we do so easily when we're stressed.
It's really interesting to me that our natural tendency to alleviate anxiety actually causes more. It's such a paradox.
Well,
Oh, go
yeah.
ahead.
I mean, we can get by with it. I think it's important to stress that we wouldn't do it if it didn't work really well a lot of the time. It's
That's
just
fair.
at some point the wheels kind of fall off the wagon. Or if you introduce enough stress, what you normally do fails to work anymore. And so, I think people can have successful 50-year marriages where one person just kind of runs the show because nothing super stressful has happened to them. Right. And so it's just, we all have different circumstances and different experiences. And, for a lot of people, they just find that these automatic behaviors, aren't they, they might calm you down, but they don't really represent who you're trying to be as a person. And they're not that enjoyable a lot of the time either. So maybe a little bit of extra anxiety is worth the price of kind of pulling the plug on some of this stuff.
Yeah. Can we flip the script now and talk a little bit about the underfunctioner? Because I think they don't get a whole lot of attention. I think the overfunctioners are typically the more proactive ones that are looking for the solutions. And if we've got people who are, when they get stressed, they kind of like curl up in a little ball and they want to be taken care of.
Play dead, basically.
Yeah,
in the animal kingdom. Yeah.
Yep. What advice do you have for people who have that response to anxiety to kind of help them engage in the relationship? Because I know that can be crippling as well, and there's a lot of shame that accompanies that, and guilt. So yeah.
Yeah, I think first just prefacing that we are all underfunctioners in our own way, even those of us who love to be super helpful and organize things for everybody. Just to give you an example, I'm trying to think of all the things I've never learned how to do because my husband always does them for me. That's a pretty long list. I think most of us could say that in our marriages. But I think of an example like, again, this is pre-COVID times, but I was calling an Uber to go somewhere, and I was standing on the street corner with my husband, and the app wasn't working right or something. And I was just getting really frustrated. And I immediately handed the phone to him and was like, you take it, you do
Fix
this. Right. And, in hindsight, if I had been by myself, I would have been perfectly capable of fixing that problem. Right. But because there was another person who was there to do it, I became less responsible, right? And so it's just so automatic when you're stressed. And so I think while marriages can have that seesaw and one person can be more helpless than the other a lot of the time, I think for most of us, there is sort of that back and forth. And depending on who's more stressed out at the time, maybe they're going to act a little bit more helpless, if that makes sense. So just to kind of preface it, like I think anyone can benefit from thinking about how they underfunction in their relationship. And so I think what's useful for the underfunctioner to remember is that it's not anyone's fault per se, or you are both responsible for how you behave in the relationship. So I don't think of that as it's both your faults. I think of that as it's a reciprocal dynamic. You both get something out of it, right? But it only takes one person to interrupt it. Some people, they want to be on the same page. They want to both be doing the same thing. I really believe it only takes one person who's curious thinking about this stuff to kind of interrupt the dynamic. So if you feel like you're the underfunctioner, just recognizing that if you begin to step up more and take more responsibility, you might get some pushback at first. People don't want to give up, the throne or their sort of control of things. But if you can kind of just hang in there and stay calm about it, people will begin to see that you are capable and that you can handle some of these things. I think what happens a lot of the time is people start to want to do more from themselves, and the other person shuts it down real fast, and then they get hurt and they don't try anymore. You see this a lot in families with addiction. People desperately want a family member to get sober, and then they do, and nobody knows how to act around them anymore, right? Because all of a sudden they become this maybe more responsible human, and people don't trust it, right? And so just kind of anticipating that if you're stepping up more, if you're acting helpless less often, people aren't necessarily going to like it. They're going to go, "Who are you? What happened to you? I don't know you anymore. Oh, you think you're such a big shot, right? You know everything," right? The families will have all of these reactions. A spouse might have those reactions too. But just to kind of see that as, to not take it personally, to just say, yeah, this is the system pushing back because someone's trying to do something differently than what we normally do, and we don't like that. We want to do what's predictable and what we always do. But if a person can hang with it long enough, then everything else kind of has to reorient itself. People learn that, okay, yeah, it seems like he can get to work by himself. It seems like he can do his homework and manage that responsibility. Maybe I don't need to check up on him as much. People do readjust, if that makes sense.
For sure. Totally makes sense. How would you distinguish the difference between somebody who's depressed and somebody who's underfunctioning?
Yeah, so I think, at least from a Bowen theory perspective, symptoms emerge when these dynamics sort of fail to be effective at some point, if that makes sense. So, a person can become depressed or experience symptoms of a depression because somehow, or not because, but it can be sort of be an effect of somehow this underfunctioning dynamic. It just isn't really working. It's really being hard on a person, and they have become less capable and less resilient and less able to cope with challenges. And then you see these symptoms sort of emerge. So I think depression can definitely be a piece of it. And on the flip side, if a person becomes depressed, everyone in their family or their spouse might begin to treat them like they are less capable because they're so worried about them, right? And that sort of leaves them further stuck in this kind of one down position, So I think if you have a family member or a partner who's distressed, you have to ask yourself, what's helpful and what's me just jumping in and doing things for them because I'm so anxious about their depression, right? Or I'm just assuming they can't do something. That's really not helpful to a person, And there are ways to be a resource to them without feeling like you're responsible for their entire life. But that's really hard because when you're really worried about somebody, it's just so automatic to jump in and just help them and take care of them in that way.
That is true. That's interesting how those two things can play into each other. They're just very enmeshed in a sense.
Sure.
I want to bounce back to that's a really helpful answer, by the way. I want to bounce back to you made mention of addiction and how sometimes when somebody gets sober, nobody knows how to act around them, and it can cause problems. One of the things that I hear a lot about from the community I was raised in a very conservative religious background. And one of the things that seems to plague conservative religious couples more than other couples is what many would call pornography addiction. I wouldn't label it as that, but it's a porn problem. And typically what happens is you get a guy who's looking at pornography, and then the wife in a heterosexual relationship finds out, feels betrayed, and then it turns into this whole, like, he's got a problem, and she, like, her only solution in the culture that I come from is she holds her breath and waits for him to hopefully not quote unquote relapse. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so in a situation like that, where, like, I notice in a lot of situations where this is a problem, the man starts to get micromanaged a lot, and unfortunately, like, the wife oftentimes doesn't have anything to move towards. They're only moving away from a problem. How, this is kind of a convoluted
That's
question.
okay. I'm
But,
with
like,
you.
if we kind of loop back to a similar situation, if you want to take that concept of addiction and apply it to this problem, because I know there's probably people who are watching who are curious about it.
Sure.
Can you talk a bit about the dynamic? And, like, let's say you've got, because traditionally speaking, the problem is man's looking at porn, wife feels betrayed. It's not very often flip-flopped. So it's going to be a little heteronormative here, but
That's okay.
in that situation, how can the over-functioning, under-functioning dynamic play out, and how can we kind of, like, scale back, and instead of just focusing on monitoring each other's behavior and moving away from something bad, like, have an alternative way to actually move the relationship back towards health?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I have so many thoughts about that.
Yeah, I would love for you to share any and all thoughts that you
Yeah.
would like.
Well, I think it goes back to this discussion of, what is the reality, and responding to the reality in the moment and not the what ifs. Can you, if your partner has this addiction or this problem, to ask yourself, what are the facts currently and how do I want to respond to them? Not what might the facts be a year from now or 10 years from now. Because I think in relationships, and this goes along with, if there's been cheating and people decide to stay together, et cetera, it's kind of similar.
Very similar.
People are responding to future scenarios, and that is not helpful to the person who's maybe trying to get better, maybe not trying to get better. I don't know. But to think about how, I wouldn't say that overfunctioning causes addiction, right? Because people are responsible for themselves and their choices. Sure. But how always assuming what a person is thinking, what they are capable of or not capable of, how that has stifled intimacy in the relationship and has sort of allowed for this maybe pretend closeness that's not a real closeness, because these people don't have a one-to-one relationship. They're maybe not talking about what's important to them or what their challenges are. So, in an example like that, I would think about, is the couple able to communicate what their challenges are instead of assuming what the challenges are of the other person, to not guess what's going to happen, but to ask, if the person with the addiction to say, how do you think you're going to manage this? What has been helpful for you? What hasn't? How have my responses been helpful? How have they not? When you are so scared and
those questions right there alone are like so powerful, but we don't think to ask them.
And they're so much calmer, right?
Yeah.
And so when you're able to do that, people give you useful information, first of all. And you are also treating them like they can handle it or they're going to figure it out, right? And so taking the time to kind of, the thing is, I think it requires a level of curiosity or genuine interest. And it's so hard to be curious when you are fearful about the future of your marriage, right? That's the last thing you feel is curious, right?
Yeah, you just want to protect yourself.
Yeah, it's dread, fear, all of those emotions. And so, to make the space to be curious about this person's path and what they've been able to do or not do, I think allows a level of intimacy that kind of can interrupt some of this overfunctioning and underfunctioning. And so, we don't often take the time to ask, our spouses or our partners those types of questions, but I think they're really important for the relationship.
I want to just get a list of 50 questions that you could ask to help have these conversations.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it just barely that overfunctioning, or so you said overfunctioning can like kill intimacy. Can you talk a little bit more about why that happens? Like how you might have you might think you have closeness and intimacy, but it's kind of a counterfeit.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, it's kind of this the paradox, this idea that the more separate you are as an individual, the closer you can become to another person because you're less allergic to each other. You are not functioning as this sort of anxious blob where I take over and do this thing for you and you act helpless, right? That's that fusion, right?
Can you give an example of how that plays out in just a hypothetical couple?
Yeah, I mean, I would think about, a person they have a really stressful job. They come home at the end of the day and they start talking about it and their spouse immediately jumps in and says, "Well, here's what you need to do. Did you do this?" Like, "Well, I don't know. I kind of see this other person's point of view." Like, those are all not helpful response. Or the other response might be, "This is making me too anxious. I can't talk to you about this," because they're just so allergic, right? And so I think the first example is more overfunctioning, right? But that doesn't foster intimacy because you're not treating the other person like an individual. You're treating them like, oh, we're a unit. What I think, you think, what I assume, you assume, what I do, you do, right? There's no separateness. And it's hard to enjoy each other's company because the less separateness there is, the more sensitive you are to each other's stress and each other's anxiety. And so there's no hope for one of you staying calm when the other person is all worked up. You just automatically match each other's level of panic or whatever. And so the more separateness you have, one person can be calm, the other person might start to calm down a little bit. You can enjoy each other, you can be close, you can talk about difficult things, right? And that is great.
I love that. So I want to create a little bit more clarity around the separateness that you're describing, because I think you're right. I think in my experience, the most contagious emotion is anxiety. Like if my wife is anxious, it requires a conscious effort on my part not to get sucked into it.
Sure.
Do the problem solving thing that you just talked about, or like have a like when she has a bad day, then it ruins my day. It's the whole, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy.
Right. That's very true.
Happy wife, happy life. Like
yes.
You can't, it's unhealthy to go through life managing your partner's emotions and being responsible for making sure that they're in a good mood, or when they're in a bad mood, having it drag you into that same bad mood. So what does it mean to be separate in a relationship where especially a lot of people are raised with this concept of being one, like how when you get married, you're no longer a me, you're a we. And let's talk about that separateness a little bit.
Yeah, I'm thinking of I grew up in a conservative Christian background as well. I'm imagining at the wedding, where they have the two candles and then they light the one, right? Like you're not a person anymore, you're a unit. And I understand the symbolism of that, but I think it can be problematic as well. Yeah, so, I think, well, just to preface it, so in Bowen theory, there's this idea of differentiation, and there's two pieces of it. There's the separateness, but there's also the connectedness. And you've got to have both to have a good relationship. But we often focus on the connected part and not the separate part. And the separate part is, do you know your own mind? Do you know what you think about a situation? Do you know what you believe, what you value? Do you have principles that you're trying to use to guide you through life? Right? When another person is anxious, can you access your own thinking? And like you just described, that is very difficult to do, because what we tend to do is we just feel the anxiety, or we can't think at all, or we borrow the other person's thinking and just say, okay, well, I'll just believe that because I love them, I trust them, so we'll just go with that, right? Which is what we do a lot of the time. And so, that's
why it's so hard to decide where you want to eat on a date. Like,
sure.
What restaurant to go to.
There's no separateness,
I don't want to make a decision. You make a decision.
Exactly. Yeah. And so just that willingness to think and act for yourself in a relationship, to make decisions that are based on your thinking and not relationship pressure. The more you can do that, I think the more separate you are.
That is wonderful. Any tips on creating more separateness if you feel, what I'm getting from this is that part of the reason that so many people might get sucked into the overfunctioning, underfunctioning tendencies to manage their anxiety is because they don't have this separateness. They haven't learned. They're so enmeshed. They're taking care of each other. They're managing each other's emotions and responsibilities and behaviors and words, and it just there's too much entanglement. And so I think part of the step, and these might be kind of two sides of the same coin, but one side is like, how do I manage my own anxiety? But the other side is, how do I know who I am separate from my partner, separate from like their emotions and their experiences?
Yeah, well, I think of it as, if you want to be more separate, there's an individual piece and there's a relationship piece, and you got to have both. The individual piece is, can you sit down and take some time every now and then to write down your thinking about what you want to do about a situation, what you believe about something? That's hard work and it takes time, and most of us don't do it about most issues or most problems, right? But to make the space to say, what do I actually think about the situation? What do I actually believe? And I think that's great before you get married, to sit down and ask yourself,
For sure.
what do I think about what a successful marriage looks like? Or how would I define what being a good partner looks like? Can I do that thinking for myself? And that's really useful. And so that's the individual piece. And then the relationship piece is, can I hold on to that thinking when things get tense? I'm not a sports person. I'm definitely not a basketball person, but I compare it to making like a 3-point shot or something, right? You have to have the skills of making the shot, right? But then you actually have to be able to do it in a basketball game.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's that individual piece, there's the technical piece, right? And then there's the piece where other humans are involved, which is an added level of difficulty.
For sure.
Where people are coming at you. So, but often we focus on the latter and not the hard work of, what do I actually believe about the situation? What kind of human am I trying to be? And, when people date, when they're looking for a partner, usually what they're asking themselves is, what am I looking for in a partner? They're not asking themselves, who am I trying to be as a partner? Mm-hmm. And I think the latter is the first question is useful, but I think the second one is a lot more helpful.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what people are looking for when they're dating also is somebody that makes them feel good. Mm-hmm. And that's where that's kind of where this guy, David Schnarch, wrote a book called The Passionate Marriage. And one of the things he talks about is how we all get married for the wrong reasons, but we learn to stay married for the right ones. Mm. And the idea is like, you go out in the world and you look for somebody who validates you, who makes you feel good about yourself, who makes you feel important, makes you feel like your opinions are worthwhile, and you just feel good around them. And then you marry them and you start spending time with them, and then you realize, oh, they have imperfections, they have flaws, they like do things that annoy me, and they aren't always there to validate me. Sometimes they invalidate me. Sometimes I feel more insecure around them than I do anybody else. And so you start to like withdraw and make yourself safe, or even more importantly, you try and manage the other person and control the other person to make you feel good, and manipulate their behavior and how they show up. And I think that ultimately, like that quote, what it turns into is, instead of being with this person because they make me feel good, you're with this person because they expose your weaknesses, and it gives you a chance to work on exactly what we're talking about, which is differentiation. How can I sit with somebody who makes me deeply uncomfortable, who makes me feel anxious, who makes me feel insecure, and like breathe into that a little bit, mm-hmm. and explore who I am on the other side of it, if I can tolerate it and handle it well.
Yeah, that's such a gift to your partner if you can do that. And I mean, another way of thinking makes me feel good. I think that's true. I think of it as finding somebody who fits the puzzle piece, right? You have these predictable automatic behaviors, and if you find the person who is the underfunctioner, right, or who is willing to let you kind of run the show, that achieves a certain level of calmness, right? And that does create good feelings, right? Yeah. Because you found somebody who fits into the dynamics of your family or whatnot, and that just happens. I think that's why it's less common for two oldest siblings to get married. I mean, it happens, but oldest are much more likely to marry youngest, right? Because of those family positions. So it's interesting to see.
Man, I could talk to you for hours about this stuff. But I think that you've given us enough food for thought. Like there's a lot here for people to glom onto. And I appreciate you not only like talking about this theoretically, but giving us some practical ideas of things that we can actually go do and implement and work on personally. Um, I think you're right. I think the tendency is to come in to a therapist's office or to show up in life and just think these are the ways that my partner is misbehaving and participating in this dynamic that makes me miserable. But when you change the system, the other person is forced to change. And I think you've given us all a lot of things that we can think about and work on as individuals that will change the dynamic of our marriages, which I think is really powerful.
Well, thank you. And I think it's such a hopeful message that if you change yourself, you change the whole picture.
Isn't it?
That gives me encouragement.
Yeah, it gives you power.
Yeah.
And we like being in control. I mean, that's where the anxiety comes from in the first place, is feeling like we have a loss of control. And so hopefully there's people watching and listening that hear this message and they think, okay, I have more control now. And it puts you a little bit at ease, knowing that you might need to go through some discomfort in order to outgrow the problems that you're experiencing right now. But the short-term discomfort is not nearly as awesome as the long-term gains that are on the other side.
It's a perfect way of summarizing it.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. And
No problem.
everybody, before we stop the recording, go buy this book. If you enjoyed this conversation, go buy the book. It is very, very, very good. And I'm really enjoying it. Okay, if you loved that interview with Dr. Kathleen Smith, you will love the other interview that I did with her that is not on this YouTube channel. So you can find it by going to areweroommates.com. It was part of a virtual summit, an online event that I did last year, where I interviewed 30 experts about what they would do to get their marriage out of roommate syndrome if they ever felt like they had kind of fallen into a rut and that spark had faded. And Dr. Smith's session was so good. It was so good. And I know if you enjoyed this interview with her that you'll really enjoy that one as well. Just go to areweroommates.com if you want to check it out. And in case you want a taste of something else really awesome, I have a fantastic interview that I did with Doctors John and Julie Gottman a while back at a live event, and you can check that out right here. Look, I am a firm believer that most couples don't need therapy to have a great marriage. But it's incredibly rare that you'll ever get the type of marriage that you're capable of without a little bit of guidance and encouragement. There's just too much working against you. Whether it's the fact that you didn't grow up with good examples of marriage, or the terrible stuff that we get exposed to from Hollywood and reality TV, or just the fact that you're two imperfect humans trying to create an amazing life together, even though nobody has ever taught you how to do that. Now, I'm a firm believer that working on your marriage shouldn't have to feel like work. And that's exactly why I created the Epic Marriage Club. Here's how it works. You get regular monthly workshops and trainings from the top marriage experts in the world. Then, every single week, I transform those lessons into an actionable experiment that we'll do together, because you only get results when you take action. And you'll be doing these experiments with an amazing community of awesome couples that care as much about having a great marriage as you do. Plus, I'll do a monthly Q&A session to make sure that you never get stuck or hung up on anything. It's literally everything you need to have a truly epic marriage. And the best part? It's freaking fun. You get all that and a whole bunch of other awesome stuff that I haven't mentioned yet for the price of a movie ticket. So go sign up right now at epicmarriageclub.com.